I swore never to be silent whenever and wherever human beings endure suffering and humiliation. We must take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. Elie Wiesel. This was a hard video to make, not only because it drives home the brutal reality that Social Security is being looted to promote systemic discrimination against men in the United States, but because this is a difficult subject matter to put in an easily digestible way. However, before we get started, let me share with you the story of Walter L. Scott. In 2015, the New York Times reported, by his own telling, the first time Walter L. Scott went to jail for failure to pay child support, it sent his life into a tailspin. He lost what he called the best job I ever had when he spent 2 weeks in jail. Some years he paid, more recently he had not. 2 years ago, when his debt reached nearly $8,000 and he missed a court date, a warrant was issued for his arrest. By last month, that amount had more than doubled to just over $18,000. That warrant loomed large in Mr. Scott's death. On April 4, he was pulled over for a broken taillight, fled on foot, and, after a scuffle with a police officer, was fatally shot in the back. The warrant, the threat of another stay behind bars, and the potential loss of yet another job caused him to run, a brother Rodney Scott said. Every job he has had, he has gotten fired from because he went to jail because he was locked up for child support, said Mr. Scott, whose brother was working as a forklift operator when he died. He got to the point where he felt like it defeated the purpose. Walter Scott's death has focused attention on the use of jail to pressure parents to pay child support, a policy employed by many states today. Though the threat of jail is considered an effective incentive for people who are able but unwilling to pay, many critics assert that punitive policies are trapping poor men into a cycle of debt, unemployment, and prison. Parents who are truly destitute go to jail over and over again for child support debt simply because they are poor, said Sarah Garotti, a lawyer with the Southern Center for Human Rights, which filed a class action suit in Georgia on behalf of parents incarcerated without legal representation for failure to pay. We see many cases in which the person is released, they're given 3 months to pay a large amount of money, and then if they can't do that, they're tossed right back into county jail. Today, almost all decently paying jobs require either a driver's license or other type of professional license. The Atlantic delved into this issue in their 2016 report, No Driver's License, No Job. They state, ask conservatives what the poor need to do to get out of poverty, and the answer usually involves something like, get a job. But for many people, there is one very specific and often overlooked reason why that's not so easy. They don't have a driver's license. Not all jobs require a driver's license, particularly those that pay very low wages, but having one is a very common requirement for the sorts of jobs that can actually lift people out of poverty. Those in construction, manufacturing, security, and union jobs, including electricians and plumbers. Sometimes, licenses are required because employers know the jobs will be at sites across the region and need employees to be able to get there reliably and on time. Other times, licenses are required because employees may need to move cars. A listing for an auto detailer requires a license, for example, or move trucks at construction sites. Other times, though, the reasons for requiring a driver's license are a little harder to understand. Valid driver's licenses are a prerequisite for positions including a retail security officer, pay of $10.55 an hour, a caregiver for the disabled, $10 an hour, an eye care associate, an administrative assistant, and a deli clerk. Licenses to employers signal responsibility. These days, positions use a driver's license as a proxy for whether or not you're employable, says Julie Kursick, who is a senior policy advocate at Public Policy Institute of Community Advocates in Milwaukee. It means that there's fewer and fewer people in the pool of unemployed who can actually qualify. In fact, it's not just driver's licenses that are at issue here. More and more jobs are now requiring professional licenses. According to a Brookings Institute 2015 report, they state, this regulatory practice is known as occupational licensing, and it is spread to cover around 30% of the U.S. workforce, up from just 5% in the 1950s. The practice now has a significant bearing on workers of all skill levels and extends beyond the occupations of doctors, lawyers, nurses, and teachers. It's important to realize that occupational licenses are not merely state-sponsored certificates to signal that workers have completed some level of training. Occupational licensing laws forbid people from practicing in their occupation without meeting state requirements. If the rationale for licensing an electrician is to protect public safety, it is difficult to see what rationale supports licensing travel guides. Yet, 21 states require a license for travel guides. There can be an obvious disconnect between the strictness of licensing regulations and the potential harm to consumer safety. For example, Michigan requires 1,460 days of education and training to become an athletic trainer, but just 26 days to be an emergency medical technician. In fact, across all states, interior designers, barbers, cosmetologists, and manicurists all faced greater average licensing requirements than do EMTs. An obvious burden of such practice falls on would-be workers looking to enter licensed occupations. The would-be travel guide who would like to give tours of Nevada's Lake Mead may be discouraged from doing so due to onerous and expensive licensing requirements. This can have real consequences for job creation. By erecting a barrier to entry into an occupation, occupational licensing can limit employment opportunities. It can also make it harder for workers, including licensed ones, to relocate. Because requirements to obtain a license vary by state, a worker moving to a new state may need to undertake more education, training, or new examinations to work in the same occupation. So I can anticipate a potential question from viewers. Why the focus on licensing, DDJ? Well, the answer is simple. It's because feminists use the family courts to suspend fathers' driver's licenses and occupational licenses when they get behind in child support, which oftentimes is set initially too high or backdated to create an instant back child support obligation. And so we're clear. I worked as a family law professional for over 10 years, so I can tell you from experience that many fathers are subjected to back child support orders. They're extremely common in both divorce and other types of family law cases involving children. So, how many Americans have had their driver's licenses suspended? The Washington Post places this number well north of 7 million people, mostly men. Based on data from the Washington Post, the state of California has just over a 3% revocation rate of driver's licenses. That means that over 1.18 million people, mostly men, in California alone have had their driver's licenses revoked. And this number doesn't even reflect how many have had their professional licenses revoked. 9% of New Mexico's entire population has a suspended license, and somewhere between 6 and 9% of driver's licenses have been revoked in Texas. That's over 2.2 million people with driver's licenses suspended in Texas. Again, mostly men. I wonder, how many of these people have had their driver's licenses suspended for being behind in their child support? Probably most of them. Again, this doesn't even include the men who've had their professional licenses suspended for being behind in child support either. However, it gets far worse. By feminists successfully advocating the family courts to suspend the driver's and professional licenses of fathers, what they've done is systemically created a new class of criminal, fathers who've been divorce raped. You see, once the feminist family court suspends a father's driver's or other professional license for failure to pay child support, one of two things happens. Either one, he loses his job, which is guaranteed if he's a doctor, truck driver, lawyer, or any other profession that requires a driver's license or any other professional license, which will often push the father into poverty and often end in that father being homeless while his child support continues to grow. Or two, he continues to drive to work without his license in an effort to catch up on his child support, making him a criminal. You see, if he's caught with a suspended license, the family courts, now backed by the criminal court, can convict him and throw him behind bars. Driving with a suspended license is a crime in most states. Now that he has a criminal record, he's further disqualified from many more employment opportunities. This also serves to drive him into poverty and, again, homelessness. Notice the pattern here? Either way, whether or not the father chooses to respect the family court order or become a criminal, many fathers systemically targeted by the feminist family court end up in poverty and homelessness. Even worse, even if the father doesn't need a license to do his job, if he cannot pay his child support, like the tragic story of Walter Scott at the beginning of this video, he can be jailed without being found guilty of a crime and lose his job because of it. Just as importantly, his children will also suffer because they don't get the money they would have gotten if the father was able to maintain his job. Now, I know the counter-argument is that these fathers who don't pay their child support deserve to be jailed. But this is a straw man argument and doesn't even pass the straight-face test. This is because child support enforcement agencies, at will, can garnish the father's wages before he ever receives them on his paycheck from any employer in the United States. And this is authorized by law. So, if the feminist-controlled family courts were truly putting the best interests of children first, they wouldn't force fathers into a life of crime, poverty, and eventual homelessness. To be clear, feminists have been using the family courts to discriminate against and destroy fathers for decades, and then they publicly shame these fathers they discriminate against and otherwise systemically victimize and destroy. So how many American fathers are we talking about? Well, according to the National Conference of State Legislatures, in 2009, South Carolina alone found that 13.2% of everyone in county jail was there for being behind on their child support. However, all 50 states have processes for criminal prosecution for failure to pay child support. These laws generally make criminal non-support a felony or misdemeanor. That's right. Even though debtor's prison has been outlawed in the United States, feminists got laws passed that allow family courts to send fathers who owe back child support to debtor's prison. The National Conference of State Legislatures further states, the non-custodial parent is not in compliance with a child support obligation, and that non-compliance can lead to incarceration as a result of either a civil contempt or criminal non-support action taken by the state. On average, an incarcerated parent with a child support obligation has the potential to leave prison with nearly $20,000 in child support debt, having entered into the system with around half that amount owed. There was 5,589 active orders for currently incarcerated non-custodial parents involved in the 4D child support program, with 6,646 cases. There was $986,000 in new current support debt per month, with more than $97.4 million in accumulated debt. There was 15,387 currently or formerly incarcerated parents in the Illinois 4D caseload. 41% of those incarcerated parents had an average income of $10,136 per year prior to incarceration. To reiterate, even though debtor's prison has been outlawed in the United States, fathers behind in their child support debt get sentenced to debtor's prison. Then, once there, those fathers are wrongfully overbilled for child support while serving jail time. Let's call this for what it is. It's a systemic gender-based discrimination against fathers. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention, when the parent owing child support is a female, her licenses are almost never suspended, nor is she ever sentenced to jail, except in extremely rare cases. The National Conference of State Legislatures goes on to state, a significant reduction in income due to a job loss or job change is generally considered a material and substantial change for purposes of modifying child support, as long as the job loss or reduction in earnings was involuntary. However, in practice, it's been my experience this doesn't happen very often. Most fathers who attempt to reduce their child support because of involuntary job loss often get thrown out of court. Even worse, even when the courts do rule in the father's favor, the courts often bar fathers from backdating their lowered child support to the date of the job loss, resulting in these fathers being unfairly imputed child support they cannot afford. As of 2016, the Bureau of Justice Statistics found that around 1.316 million people were incarcerated in state prisons, and around 740,000 people were in local jails in the United States. Together, this is over 2 million people currently in state and local jails. Now, if we use the 13.2% child support incarceration stat from the 2009 South Carolina study I previously talked about, and extrapolate it on a national level using the Bureau of Justice Statistics numbers from 2016. This means that close to 260,000 men were in state and local jails for being behind on child support. This number does not include those jailed or imprisoned for being convicted of driving or working on a suspended license that was initially suspended for being behind in child support. Let's be clear. This means that feminists are directly responsible for the wrongful imprisonment of over 260,000 American men wrongfully criminalized by the feminist family courts. Even worse, these facts demonstrate that feminists don't care about children. You see, when feminists discriminated against these fathers, they also victimized their children. By stealing these fathers' driver's licenses and professional licenses, then systemically jailing them for being behind on their child support, feminists drove these children into a life of suffering and poverty, as their fathers are being actively prevented from financially and emotionally supporting them. To be clear, using 2016 numbers, when the feminist-controlled government jailed fathers for being behind in their child support, they harmed at least 260,000 American children by forcing them into poverty and all the problems that come with it. Shamefully, many of the laws that do this, while originally proposed by feminists, were then passed by tradcons and conservatives. Further, when a father is jailed for being behind in child support, he'll lose friends and become an outcast in his own community. Is it any wonder why divorced fathers are at an increased risk to commit suicide? Think about this for a moment. If there were 260,000 cases of swine flu or Ebola in the United States, we'd call it an epidemic. But since it's at least 260,000 children annually being victimized by feminism's war on men, marriage, and family values, we ignore it. This is nothing less than a systemic feminist epidemic to destroy fathers as part of feminism's war on marriage and family values. These feminists are so hell-bent on destroying fathers, they don't care at all about the hundreds of thousands of child casualties their war creates on an annual basis. So with that said, I want to draw your attention to the previous facts I flashed on the screen when I first talked about child support earlier in this video. Do you see the highlighted portion? It says 4D. What does that mean? Well, what they're referring to is Title 4D of the U.S. Federal Social Security Act. Looting the U.S. Social Security Fund is one of the major ways feminists fund their systemic discrimination of fathers. You can see from this chart provided by the United States Department of Health and Human Services that annually, on average, feminists looted Social Security of at least $4 billion a year between the years of 2008 to 2016. This is over $36 billion stolen from Social Security to discriminate against fathers from 2008 to 2016 alone. Further, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Office of Child Support Enforcement states state and local child support agencies receive funding to operate their programs. This funding comes from state and local governments and the federal government. The Child Support Program is a federal matching grant program under which state and local governments must spend money in order to receive funding. For every dollar a state or local government spends on the Child Support Program, it receives 66 cents from the federal government. The federal government also provides incentive payments, which are designed to encourage states to operate strong performance-based child support programs. That's right. For every dollar feminist-controlled state and local child support agencies use to discriminate against men, the federal government reimburses them 66 cents on every dollar. Further, the federal government admits it bribes these state and local agencies with incentive payments to financially encourage them to go after fathers. So, what are these incentives? Title 4D of the Social Security Act, Section 455, subsection A3, gives us a clue as to what sort of incentives are involved. It states in pertinent part, the Secretary shall pay to each state for each quarter in fiscal years 1996 and 1997 90% of so much of state expenditures described in paragraph 1B as the Secretary finds are for a system meeting the requirements specified in Section 454. So, Let's break this down. In 1996 and 1997 alone, if state and local child support agencies met their male discrimination quotas, then the federal government would loot the Social Security fund to reimburse them as much as 90 cents on every dollar these child support agencies spent in witch hunting fathers. So that begs the question, how much did the federal government incentivize feminists to witch hunt men in other years? We may never know, but we do know this. The federal government is actively looting Social Security to the tune of billions of dollars every year. This money funded feminist discrimination against men by using these men's children as props to cover for their systemic witch hunt through child support enforcement. In 2016 alone, this witch hunt was directly responsible for wrongfully jailing over 250,000 American men. This not only deprived over 250,000 American children of their father's financial support, but, by design, forced many of these children into a life of poverty and deprived these children of their father's love. Knowing this, is it any wonder why these child victims of feminism grow up and hate their fathers? Feminism not only destroyed families with their war on marriage, then, once the marriage was dead, feminists systemically discriminated against divorced fathers, financed by their quiet looting of billions of dollars from the Social Security fund. The thing is, whether you're married, divorced, or never married, whether you're young, middle-aged, or retired, whether you're a man, a woman, or identify as pig defecation, if you're an American citizen, this affects you. This is especially true if you're a tax-paying American citizen paying into or receiving Social Security. Make no mistake, this isn't only a feminist systemic genocide against men, but it's also irreparably damaging hundreds of thousands of children every year. If these laws aren't repealed, then, like the story of Walter Scott in the beginning of this video, this feminist witch hunt will continue to drive millions of American men to desperation, poverty, homelessness, and eventually kill them, leaving their children without a father. So what do? Well, I strongly encourage you to share this video with your elected officials and ask, why are feminists being allowed to loot billions of your Social Security tax dollars to systemically destroy American men and force their children into a life of hardship and poverty? If you don't, feminists will continue to steal billions of your taxpayer dollars every year from Social Security until it's gone, and every tax-paying American will suffer for it. I'm DDJ, and this has been your dose of misandry today.